Security, get this janitor out of my boardroom.
Elaine Whitmore's voice sliced through the air, sharp and commanding, while Daniel Hayes stood frozen with a plunger balanced perfectly on his head. A ripple of laughter had just broken out among the assistants and lower staff, now silenced by the CEO's icy glare. Daniel didn't flinch. He simply looked at her, calm, almost steadying the ridiculous object with more dignity than the crown she imagined herself wearing. "You think I don't belong here," he said quietly, his voice low enough to force everyone to lean in. "But sooner than you think, it'll be me, not you, the entire room looks to for help. If you don't want to miss what happens next, when the janitor reveals exactly who he really is and why this CEO will regret humiliating him, hit subscribe right now. You're about to see why appearances in this room mean nothing." Daniel finally lowered the plunger with deliberate care, as if it were fragile crystal, not rubber and wood. His posture was relaxed, almost amused, though his steel-gray eyes betrayed something else, a man who had been through storms far greater than corporate disdain. He wasn't rattled. He wasn't scrambling. He stood with the same quiet balance he always carried, because Daniel Hayes was more than what they saw, more than the mop, more than the uniform, more than the paycheck that barely stretched to cover rent and his daughter Sophie's asthma medication. He had once worn a different uniform, one that came with stripes, respect, and a weight of responsibility most of these executives couldn't imagine. That history hummed inside him, untouchable, though no one here suspected it. The truth was, Daniel didn't play the fool to seek attention. He did it to soften the edges of sterile rooms, to remind people that laughter belonged even in marble corridors and glass towers. To Sophie, he was a hero for finding light when others only saw gloom. To Elaine Whitmore, he was an embarrassment, a reminder that imperfection lurked in her empire of polished glass. But humiliation wasn't new to him. He'd endured worse, being shoved aside after his service ended, overlooked by employers who saw only overqualified, abandoned by colleagues who had once depended on his steady hands in chaos. Every dismissal carved another scar, but none had broken him. He still carried humor like a shield, because it was the one thing no one could strip away. And yet, here he was again, publicly diminished, a grown man treated like a nuisance in front of an entire floor of staff. He could feel the ripple of unease, the way the assistants shifted in their seats, too afraid to laugh now, too afraid not to. It was always the same. Power dictated the tone of the room. "Where are you watching from? Because I need you to lean in, right here, right now." Elaine Whitmore has no idea who she's just tried to break. She doesn't know that her perfect world will soon tremble. And when it does, the one man she despises will be the only one who can save what she loves most. Elaine's lips curled into the faintest smile as the silence thickened. "You think this is a comedy club, Mr. Hayes?" she asked, her voice smooth but dripping with disdain. "This is Whitmore Global. We don't have time for clowns with plungers." The board members smirked behind their polished glasses, each waiting to see how far their CEO would push the humiliation. Daniel didn't move. His hands rested calmly at his sides, the plunger now tucked neatly against the cleaning cart. He wasn't angry. Not yet. His stillness unnerved some of the assistants in the back row, who had laughed a little too hard before being silenced. It wasn't the look of a man embarrassed. It was the look of someone biding his time. Elaine snapped her fingers at security. 2 guards stepped forward, broad shoulders filling the doorway. "Escort him out. Permanently," she ordered. The words hit Daniel like a gavel slamming down, not because of the threat to his job, but because Sophie depended on the medical insurance tied to it. Losing this position wasn't about pride, it was about survival. Ma'am, he was only— One assistant started, her voice faltering when Elaine's glare cut her short. The moment carried its weight. Elaine had the power, and she wanted everyone reminded of it. To her, Daniel was expendable, an inconvenience interrupting the image she curated with marble floors, abstract art, and stock tickers glowing on the walls. Daniel gathered his cleaning supplies with steady precision, each movement deliberate. He refused to rush, refused to let them see panic. Inside, he thought of Sophie's inhaler and the rising pharmacy bills. Humiliation he could endure. But being stripped of his means to protect his daughter, that was an attack that burned deeper. As he pushed the cart toward the door, whispers traveled the room. "He's always like that, keeping the mood light," one young intern murmured. Another added, "Better energy than half the executives here." Their words weren't loud, but Daniel heard them. He always listened, even when people thought he didn't. And in listening, he knew something others didn't. Dignity never died quietly. The guards waited. Daniel nodded politely to them, then glanced back once at Elaine. She was already scrolling through her tablet, dismissing him from her mind as if he were no more relevant than dust on the floor. That, more than her words, lit the quiet fire in his chest. She believed power insulated her from consequence. She believed nothing he carried mattered, but Daniel knew better. Life had a way of tilting. One moment, control seemed absolute. The next, chaos leveled everything. He had seen it on battlefields, in disaster zones, in hospitals where seconds meant life or death. Money and titles didn't hold the line when reality shattered. Skill did, calm did, a steady hand did. That. Knowledge wasn't visible to them yet, but it pulsed through Daniel's every step as he left the boardroom. He wasn't planning revenge. He wasn't planning anything. He didn't need to. Life had a way of creating the test itself, and when it came, he'd be ready. Out in the corridor, Daniel paused, leaning against the cart for just a moment. His heart wasn't racing. He'd trained too long for panic. Instead, he breathed slowly, grounding himself. Sophie's picture peeked from his wallet, taped behind the ID badge he wore. Her smile anchored him, reminded him why he carried this job despite the ridicule, why he endured the dismissals and the smirks. Behind the closed doors, the meeting resumed. The click of heels, the shuffle of papers, the self-satisfied tone of Elaine's voice filtered faintly through the corridor. To her, the world had returned to order. To Daniel, a clock had started ticking. He couldn't see the shape of the crisis yet, but instinct told him it was near. The cleaning cart rattled down the hall, wheels squeaking against polished stone. A few employees passed him, offering sympathetic smiles they were too afraid to voice in words. He nodded back, grateful but detached. Sympathy didn't pay bills. Sympathy didn't secure Sophie's medicine. By the time he reached the service elevator, Daniel's expression had returned to its usual mask of quiet composure. He pressed the button, waiting as the hum of machinery echoed faintly. His thoughts didn't linger on humiliation. They lingered on readiness. Every dismissal only sharpened the edge he still carried, the part of him that never left the uniform he once wore. Elaine thought she had closed the chapter, but Daniel knew the story was only beginning. Daniel stepped into the service elevator, the heavy doors sliding shut with a metallic sigh. The fluorescent lights hummed faintly above him as the cart creaked in the confined space. He leaned against the rail, exhaling slowly, the faint smell of disinfectant clinging to his hands. For a moment, the weight of Elaine's words replayed in his mind. Not the insult itself, but the cold permanence in "escort him out." Permanently. The elevator jolted downward, stopping at the lobby level. When the doors opened, Daniel pushed his cart into the wide marble hall. Employees bustled around in sharp suits, their footsteps echoing in the cavernous space. No one gave him more than a glance, though a few carried the quiet guilt of having overheard what happened upstairs. He noticed the way their eyes flickered, then quickly moved away. Silence was always safer than speaking up against power. Daniel's calm expression never wavered. He'd lived in the shadow of arrogance before. He'd been dismissed by generals who underestimated him, by administrators who measured his worth in pay grades instead of skills. But every time he'd proven himself when it mattered. His patience was not submission. It was discipline. At the far end of the lobby, Sophie sat perched on one of the benches reserved for visitors, swinging her small legs and clutching a worn book. She looked up the second she saw him, her face lighting. "Daddy!" she called, bounding over with the unguarded joy only a child could carry. Daniel crouched, meeting her at eye level. "Hey, Bug, you been waiting long?" he asked, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "Only a little. Miss Lila sat with me for a while," Sophie said, pointing toward the corner. There, Elaine's daughter, Lila, fiddled with her phone, her posture stiff, as if she didn't quite belong in the high-rise world her mother ruled. Daniel nodded respectfully in her direction, recognizing the bridge fate had quietly placed in the lobby. Sophie leaned in closer. "She said her mom doesn't like people making noise." The child's whisper carried the kind of innocent truth that struck harder than any insult. Daniel smiled faintly, his chest tightening. "Sometimes grown-ups forget what matters," he murmured, squeezing her hand. He rose, placing a steadying palm on the cleaning cart. The presence of his daughter anchored him, pulling his focus back from humiliation towards something larger. His fight wasn't with Elaine's arrogance, it was with the weight of a world that told his little girl she should feel less because of who her father was. Lila looked up, catching his gaze for the briefest moment. There was no malice there, only curiosity, and maybe a quiet sympathy she couldn't voice in her mother's presence. Then, almost shyly, she slipped her phone into her pocket and wandered off toward the elevators. Daniel guided Sophie back to the bench, sitting beside her as she flipped open her book. The lobby was busy, but his attention narrowed on her soft breathing, the way she occasionally coughed lightly against her sleeve. It was a reminder of why this job mattered. It wasn't the paycheck alone. It was the stability, the insurance, the tether to a system that provided medicine she couldn't go without. Every insult he endured was measured against that need. Every dismissal was a debt he willingly absorbed if it kept Sophie safe. But Elaine had crossed into dangerous ground, threatening that tether. If she succeeded in cutting him loose, Sophie's health hung in the balance. That truth hardened his resolve more than pride ever could. Behind him, the glass doors swung open, and a group of executives swept into the lobby, laughter sharp and echoing. Their designer coats, the glint of expensive watches, the scent of cologne filled the air like a wall of wealth. Sophie's eyes tracked them nervously, sensing the divide even if she couldn't name it. Daniel placed an arm around her shoulders. "Don't worry," he whispered. "We've been through worse." He didn't tell her how true those words were, how many nights he'd steadied wounded soldiers in the desert while chaos roared. Those memories stayed locked inside, part of the man no one here imagined. The executives vanished into the street, and quiet returned. Daniel closed his eyes for a second, steadying himself. His humiliation upstairs wasn't an ending. It was a spark. He could feel it. Somewhere soon, this polished empire would stumble into chaos, and when it did, Elaine would find her wealth useless. And then, the man she dismissed as just the janitor would be the only one standing between order and disaster. The thought lingered in Daniel's mind as he sat with Sophie. that this building, so certain of its order, was only one unexpected moment away from collapse. He'd seen it before, places that seemed untouchable until a single crisis exposed all their fragility. And though he couldn't predict what form it would take, he knew it was coming. Sophie tugged at his sleeve, pulling him back to the present. "Daddy, are we going home now?" she asked, her voice light but lined with the fatigue of waiting. "Soon, Bug," Daniel said softly. He glanced at the time. The late afternoon sun was beginning to pour gold through the high lobby windows, washing the marble in a glow that didn't belong to wealth but to nature. It made him think of simpler places, places he'd stood guard over men who needed him, not executives who mocked him. The elevator chimed. Lila reappeared, this time without her phone. She crossed the lobby hesitantly, her gaze darting toward Sophie. Daniel noticed the way she slowed, almost as if she wanted to say something but didn't know how. "Your book looks interesting," Lila said finally, her voice small. Sophie brightened. "It's about animals. Want to see?" She scooted over on the bench, making space. Lila sat, posture stiff but curious, her designer dress a sharp contrast to Sophie's faded sweater. Daniel watched quietly, recognizing the subtle significance. Two children from different worlds, bridging a gap neither parent would admit existed. He let them talk for a few minutes, their voices carrying softly. For all Elaine's obsession with image, her daughter seemed hungry for something simpler, connection without status. Daniel didn't interfere. He knew better than anyone the importance of letting bridges form naturally. A sudden commotion broke the calm. From the far side of the lobby, a man stumbled, clutching his chest. His briefcase clattered to the floor, papers scattering across the marble. People froze, eyes widening, but no one moved closer. Phones came out. Security whispered into radios, yet not a single executive bent to help. Daniel was on his feet instantly. His cart was close, and his body remembered before his mind did. The rhythm of emergencies. He knelt by the man, tilting him gently onto his back. "Sir, can you hear me?" His voice was firm but calm, the kind of tone meant to anchor panic. Gasps echoed around the lobby. "Isn't that the janitor?" someone whispered. Another voice answered, "What's he doing?" The guards lingered at the edges, uncertain. Daniel didn't hesitate. He checked the man's airway, scanning for color, for breath, for pulse. Years of training guided every movement, steady and precise. He pressed 2 fingers to the carotid, counting. Weak, but there. He adjusted the man's posture, loosening a tie that had become a noose around the swelling panic. Sophie stood nearby, clutching Lila's hand, her eyes wide. Daniel glanced up just once. "Bug, it's okay. Just stay back." His voice carried reassurance, though his hands never paused. In less than a minute, he stabilized the man enough to wait for paramedics. The faint color returning to the executive's cheeks was proof enough. Daniel sat back on his heels, wiping his palms against his uniform, breathing steady. Around him, the crowd buzzed in disbelief. That janitor he knew exactly what to do. Who is he, really? The questions hung in the air, unspoken but electric. When the paramedics arrived moments later, Daniel stepped aside, giving a precise report of what he'd observed. His language was crisp, professional, the kind that came only from experience. One of the paramedics gave him a sharp look, half curious, half respectful. "You've done this before," the man said quietly. Daniel only nodded, offering nothing more. As the stretcher wheeled away, the lobby remained hushed. For the first time, the marble didn't seem like a fortress. It felt fragile, shaken by the sight of a janitor doing what no one else dared. Elaine hadn't been present for the incident, but word traveled quickly. Already, Daniel could see the whispers forming among staff, the subtle shifts in their eyes when they looked at him. It wasn't respect yet, but it was something close. Curiosity, recognition. He guided Sophie toward the exit, his expression unchanged. To him it was routine, a fragment of an old life slipping out in the open. To everyone else, it was a disruption they couldn't unsee. At the revolving doors, he paused. He didn't savor the attention, didn't seek validation. He only held Sophie's hand tighter, reminded once more of why he couldn't afford to fail. Elaine Whitmore believed she had stripped him of value, but today had planted a seed, one she could never uproot. The proof that Daniel Hayes was more than what she thought he was, and when the real crisis came, that seed would bloom into something undeniable. Daniel pushed through the revolving doors, the evening air sharp against his skin. Sophie clutched his hand, her small steps matching his stride as they walked toward the bus stop. The city hummed around them, car horns, chatter, the metallic hiss of brakes. But Daniel's thoughts were still back in the marble lobby. He hadn't wanted the attention, yet he knew the sight of him kneeling over that man had shifted something in the building. "Daddy," Sophie said softly, "why were people staring at you like that?" He looked down at her face pale from the long day. "Because they're not used to seeing someone like me know what to do," he answered gently. "But it doesn't matter what they think. What matters is that man's breathing tonight." Sophie considered this, her brow furrowed. "I already knew you could do it," she said finally, gripping his hand tighter. That truth cut through him more than any whisper in the lobby had. To her, there was no surprise. He'd always been more than a janitor. The bus ride home was quiet. Sophie curled against him, her head resting on his arm. Daniel stared out the window, watching neon lights flicker by. He replayed the day's events, not with pride, but with awareness. His hand had been forced. He had revealed a glimpse of the man he used to be, and whispers were now working their way through Whitmore Global like cracks in polished glass. By the time he carried Sophie up the narrow stairs of their modest apartment building, his decision was made. He couldn't let Elaine's arrogance push him out without a fight. He had no illusions of grandeur. His life was simple, built on survival. But survival meant holding the line, and that meant protecting his job until he could find another way to keep Sophie safe. Inside their apartment was small but warm. A stack of Sophie's drawings decorated the fridge, bright colors clashing against chipped paint. Daniel set her down on the couch and fixed her inhaler nearby, always within reach. She curled up under a blanket, her book balanced on her knees. Daniel moved to the sink, washing his hands slowly. The water ran hot, steam rising. His reflection in the window above the basin looked tired but steady. He'd aged faster than he liked to admit, the lines around his eyes carved from nights without sleep and days spent swallowing pride. But beneath it, the soldier still lingered. The medic who had steadied bleeding comrades, who had refused to fold when chaos consumed others. As he dried his hands, his phone buzzed. A message from an old contact flashed across the screen. A fellow veteran, someone who hadn't spoken to him in years. "Heard you stepped in at Whitmore today. Word spreads. Stay ready." Daniel stared at the message, jaw tightening. He hadn't realized how quickly news could travel. If the veteran community already knew, then whispers inside the company would only grow louder. The mask of anonymity he'd worn for years was slipping. Sophie's quiet voice interrupted his thoughts. "Daddy, are you okay?" He turned, forcing a small smile. "I'm fine, Bug. Just thinking." She nodded, satisfied, and returned to her book. But Daniel knew she saw more than she admitted. She always did. That night, as he tucked her into bed, he paused longer than usual, watching her breathe steadily in sleep. Every choice, every humiliation he endured was for her. That was the line he would never cross. She had to be safe. Elaine Whitmore could strip him of dignity in boardrooms, but she would not take that from him. The next morning, Daniel arrived at the building before dawn. The lobby was still, the marble floors reflecting the faint glow of early light. He began his routine. Mop in hand, quiet and deliberate. But even in the silence, he sensed the shift. People arrived with glances that lingered longer. Whispers exchanged more openly. The story of the janitor who had saved an executive was growing legs. When he reached the executive floor, Daniel noticed something new. A small group of employees huddled near the elevator, their conversation halting as he passed. One of them, a young analyst, muttered just loud enough to carry, "That's him?" Elaine's empire thrived on control, but control cracked when perception shifted. Daniel had not sought to be seen, yet now he was, and once people saw, they couldn't unsee. Victory strategy progress was already moving. Elaine's wealth and arrogance couldn't command health, couldn't buy calm under pressure. Only Daniel had carried that, and whether Elaine liked it or not, the building was beginning to realize it. Daniel kept his eyes down as he moved along the corridor, mop gliding across polished tile. The young analyst's whispered words still hung in the air. "That's him." It wasn't accusation this time. It wasn't mockery. It was recognition. The rhythm of the mop swish steadied him, the way repetition always did. Yet he felt the change around him. Assistants offered faint nods, where before there had been only indifference. Security guards, once quick to loom, now gave him space. Every gesture was small, but Daniel had learned long ago that small gestures often revealed the deepest shifts. At the far end of the hall, a meeting room door opened. Elaine emerged, heels clicking against the marble. She didn't look at him at first. Her eyes scanned her tablet, her jaw sharp with focus. But when she finally lifted her gaze, her expression hardened at the sight of him still working. "I thought I made myself clear," she said coldly, stepping closer. "You don't belong on this floor anymore." Daniel straightened, leaning the mop lightly against the wall. His calm gaze met hers. "Until someone tells me I'm officially terminated, I'll keep doing my job." His voice was even, almost quiet, but it carried enough to turn heads from nearby offices. Elaine's nostrils flared. "Your little stunt in the lobby doesn't change anything. This is a corporation, not a charity for washed-up veterans." The word landed like a spark in dry brush. Veterans. She had said it too quickly, too pointedly, as though the rumor had already reached her desk. Daniel felt the eyes of the corridor sharpen on him, waiting for a reaction. He gave none. "Go downstairs," she finished, her tone clipped, "and stay there." She turned on her heel, storming back toward the conference rooms. The authority in her stride was undeniable, but Daniel noticed the flicker of unease behind her eyes. If the rumors had rattled her, then the balance was shifting faster than she realized. He returned to his cart, moving deliberately. A janitor's silence was sometimes more powerful than a general's orders. People filled in the blanks themselves. And right now, the blanks around him were growing louder. Later that morning, as he cleaned the glass doors of the lobby, 2 security officers approached. For a moment, Daniel braced for confrontation. Instead, one of them cleared his throat. "Hey, good work yesterday. The guy you helped? He's still in the hospital, but stable. Doc said what you did probably saved him." Daniel nodded once, not breaking his rhythm with the cloth. "I just did what needed doing." The guard hesitated. Still, people noticed. With that, they walked off, leaving Daniel with the quiet satisfaction of acknowledgement. though he never asked for it. Sophie appeared after school, bounding across the lobby as she always did. But this time, something was different. She wasn't running only to him. She was pulling Lila by the hand. The two girls burst in together, giggling about something only they understood. Daniel's heart softened at the sight, even as he noticed the sharp intake of breath from onlookers. Elaine's daughter, holding hands with the janitor's child. "Daddy, Lila wanted to come sit with us," Sophie said, tugging him toward the bench. Lila gave him a shy smile, one that held no trace of her mother's hauteur. Daniel returned the smile gently. "You're welcome here," he said, his tone carrying both warmth and quiet defiance. The lobby grew heavier with the weight of perception. To staff filtering past, the sight was a contradiction they couldn't reconcile. The CEO's polished world brushing against the janitor's humble one. And the children, innocent, unpretentious, were the ones erasing the line. Daniel sat with them, listening to their chatter. He knew Elaine would bristle when she learned of this, but he also knew something deeper. Walls built on arrogance crumbled fastest when touched by innocence. That evening, as he and Sophie rode the bus home, Daniel watched her press her forehead to the window, pointing at lights flickering across the skyline. "Daddy, did you see? Everyone looked at you different today." He smiled faintly, resting a hand on her shoulder. "They're just starting to notice what matters," he said. Victory strategy progress was taking shape in ways subtle but irreversible. Elaine's power relied on image, on her word defining reality. But reality itself had begun to slip from her grasp. Twice now, crises had shown that her wealth and arrogance couldn't hold the line. Twice, Daniel's steady hand had. And soon, the test that would strip away all her illusions was coming. The bus rumbled to a stop outside their building, brakes squealing in the night air. Daniel guided Sophie down the narrow aisle, her hand tucked firmly in his. She was still chattering about her new friendship with Lila, her words carrying the breathless energy of a child who didn't know how fragile bridges could be in the adult world. Daniel smiled at her enthusiasm, but tucked away the weight of what it meant. The CEO's daughter had chosen to sit beside a janitor's child. That small choice carried ripples far larger than Sophie could imagine. Inside their apartment, Sophie darted to her desk, spreading crayons across the surface. "I'm drawing a picture for Lila tomorrow," she announced. "She doesn't smile much at school. I think maybe if she had more pictures, she'd smile more." Daniel's chest tightened at her simple kindness. Children didn't see social divides. They saw people who needed laughter, who needed color. He wished adults had the same clarity. He brewed a pot of tea, settling into the worn armchair by the window. Outside, city lights flickered like restless stars. He sipped slowly, his mind replaying Elaine's words from earlier, washed-up veteran. The way she had spat the label told him the rumors were no longer whispers. She knew. And if she knew, she would do everything in her power to bury him before that truth threatened her control. The next morning, Daniel arrived early again, mop and cart in place. As he worked, he overheard two analysts passing by. "They say he used to be a medic, like the kind who saves lives in war zones," one whispered. The other shook his head. "If that's true, what's he doing here?" Daniel kept his expression neutral, though the words struck close. That was the question everyone asked once they learned a fragment of his past. What they never understood was that life didn't follow clean lines. One day you were carrying wounded men across desert sand. The next, you were scrubbing marble floors, so your daughter had her inhaler. Dignity wasn't in the job title. It was in showing up, no matter what. At mid-morning, Daniel was summoned unexpectedly to the executive lounge. The request came from one of the board members, not Elaine. When he arrived, he found a group of directors gathered near the coffee bar, murmuring. The man he had stabilized in the lobby sat among them, pale but recovering, a blanket across his knees. "There he is," the man said, pointing toward Daniel. "That's the one who kept me breathing." All eyes turned. For a moment, the silence pressed heavy. Then the director closest to him said, "Is it true you're former military?" Daniel met their gaze evenly. "It's true I did my duty when I was called. That's all that matters." The recovering man coughed weakly. "Matters to me? If it weren't for him, I wouldn't be sitting here." The board members exchanged uneasy glances. Respect warred with discomfort. It was easier to admire skill when it didn't come wrapped in a janitor's uniform. Daniel sensed the conflict, but he didn't linger. He inclined his head once and quietly excused himself, returning to his cart. By noon, Elaine stormed into the lobby, her anger barely contained. She cornered him near the elevators, her voice low but venomous. "You think saving one man makes you indispensable? You think you can humiliate me in my own company?" Daniel held her stare. "I don't need to humiliate you, Ms. Whitmore. Reality has a way of doing that on its own." Her eyes narrowed, lips pressed into a thin line. "This ends soon," she hissed before striding away. Sophie appeared moments later, skipping into the lobby after school, her backpack bouncing. Lila trailed just behind, hesitating before rushing up to join her. The sight was almost comical, the CEO's daughter choosing once again to sit beside Sophie on the bench, their laughter carrying like bells across the polished hall. Daniel sat nearby, watching quietly. He knew Elaine's fury would only grow, but he also knew that perception was already slipping beyond her grasp. Her daughter was crossing the invisible line of class she had drawn, and every bystander noticed. Victory strategy progress advanced another step. Elaine's wealth and command could not keep her image intact. Not when her own daughter was building a bridge with the janitor's child. Not when crises kept proving that Daniel's steadiness outweighed her authority. For now, Daniel said nothing. He simply watched Sophie share her crayons with Lila, the colors spreading across paper in bright, defiant strokes. And deep down, he knew the true test was coming. A test no amount of power could buy her way through. The lobby was unusually busy the following morning, executives sweeping in for a quarterly showcase that Elaine herself would be hosting. A glass podium was being assembled near the entrance, cameras positioned to capture the CEO's polished remarks. Daniel stood off to the side with his cart, mop in hand, watching as crews fussed over lighting and floral arrangements that cost more than his month's wages. He didn't resent it. He'd long accepted that money insulated people like Elaine. What struck him now was how fragile that insulation looked once you knew where to press. Sophie skipped beside him before school, clutching the folded drawing she and Lila had made the night before. "Daddy, we're giving this to her today," she said proudly. Bright colors spilled across the page, two girls holding hands under a sun, their names scrawled across the top. Lila had even added her own smile, carefully drawn but shaky, as though she was practicing the expression through crayon. Daniel nodded. "She'll like it," he said quietly, though he knew the drawing would test Elaine's composure in front of her empire. As employees filed in, whispers followed Daniel everywhere. His name wasn't spoken often, but the weight of recognition was clear. The janitor who had steadied an executive, the man who refused to be broken even when ordered out. The rumors of his past had become a current running beneath every conversation. Elaine arrived last, her presence commanding the room. Draped in a sharp white suit, she strode toward the podium, assistants orbiting her like planets around a star. She didn't glance at Daniel, but he saw her jaw tighten when Sophie and Lila stepped forward together, clutching the drawing. "Mom," Lila said timidly, "we made this." She held out the paper, colors bright against the sterile backdrop. The crowd hushed, curious. Elaine froze. Her eyes flicked to Sophie, then to Daniel. A muscle in her cheek twitched. "Lila," she said tightly, "this isn't the time." But Lila stood firm, surprising even herself. "It's for you, from both of us." She pressed the paper into her mother's hand. For a brief second, Elaine faltered, her perfect posture breaking as she stared at the innocent image. The crowd leaned in, sensing something raw beneath her polished veneer. Daniel didn't move. He simply rested his hand on Sophie's shoulder, anchoring her. He knew innocence had a way of revealing truths no confrontation could force. Elaine recovered quickly, tucking the paper into a folder, as if it were just another document. "Thank you, sweetheart," she said briskly, brushing past her daughter toward the podium. Yet her steps were sharper than usual, her control cracking at the edges. The showcase began, Elaine's voice carrying across the lobby with rehearsed ease. She spoke of market growth, innovation, the strength of Whitmore Global. Cameras flashed, board members nodded, and staff scribbled notes. Yet beneath the performance, Daniel sensed tension. He watched her glance repeatedly toward the bench where Sophie and Lila sat together, their quiet laughter like background music she couldn't mute. Halfway through her speech, the moment arrived. Lila swayed suddenly on the bench, her face paling. Sophie cried out, clutching her arm as the girl's body stiffened. Gasps tore through the crowd. Elaine's voice cut off mid-sentence. "Lila!" she screamed, vaulting from the podium, heels clattering against marble. The crowd surged forward, panic spreading. Cameras swung to capture the scene. Daniel was already moving. In 3 strides he reached the bench, kneeling beside Lila as she struggled to breathe. Her lips trembled, her chest rising too shallow. He recognized it instantly. An allergic reaction, severe and escalating fast. "Clear space!" Daniel barked, his voice commanding, sharp enough to slice through chaos. Shock rippled the crowd, the janitor giving orders. But people obeyed. He tilted Lila carefully, loosening the collar of her dress, checking her airway. "Sophie, get my bag from the cart." His daughter sprinted, returning seconds later with the kit Daniel always carried. A remnant of his past life he had never abandoned. Elaine dropped to her knees beside him, frantic. "Do something. Please." Her voice cracked, stripped of authority, raw with terror. Daniel's hands moved steadily, pulling an epinephrine injector from the kit. "She's in anaphylaxis," he said, his tone clipped, professional. "She needs this now." He pressed the injector to Lila's thigh, holding firm. The crowd held its breath. For a long second, nothing moved but Daniel's hands. Then Lila gasped sharply, her chest expanding, color flooding back into her cheeks. Sophie squeezed her friend's hand, tears streaking her face. Relief rippled through the lobby like a wave. Elaine clutched her daughter, sobbing openly. Cameras caught every angle. The CEO undone, her child saved by the man she had called a clown with a plunger. Daniel stood slowly, his expression calm, his breath steady. He didn't revel in the attention, didn't even glance at the cameras. He only looked at Sophie, her wide eyes locked on him with pride. The victory strategy had revealed itself in full. Elaine's wealth, her authority, her image, none of it could save her daughter. Only Daniel's hidden expertise, forged long before this building, had mattered. And now, in front of witnesses, the balance of power had shifted forever. The lobby was still buzzing long after the paramedics had wheeled Lila out for further monitoring. Employees lingered in clusters, their hushed conversations a mixture of awe and disbelief. The image of Daniel kneeling with practiced calm beside Elaine's daughter had seared itself into every witness's memory. No one could erase it. Daniel stood near his cart, Sophie at his side, her small hand clasped in his. He kept his expression neutral, though his pulse still thrummed with the aftershock of adrenaline. He had faced worse in deserts and field hospitals, but something about saving a child, about saving Sophie's friend, dug deeper than all the rest. Across the room, Elaine clutched her phone, barking into it between ragged breaths. Her usual poise was gone, her words tangled with panic as she tried to manage the optics. "No, do not let the press release that footage without my approval," she snapped. "Frame it carefully. It was a team response." Yet even as she spoke, she knew the truth was slipping through her fingers. Cameras had caught everything. Board members exchanged looks she couldn't control. Assistants stole glances at Daniel, whispers growing bolder. He knew exactly what to do. He saved her. Daniel bent to Sophie's level. "You okay, Bug?" She nodded quickly, though her eyes were still wet. "She was so scared, Daddy, but you weren't. You didn't even shake." Daniel squeezed her shoulder. "That's what training's for. When people need help, you can't afford to shake." His voice was soft, but those close enough to hear felt the weight of it. Elaine ended her call and turned sharply, striding toward Daniel. For once, her heels didn't sound like authority. They sounded like desperation. She stopped inches from him, her eyes flashing with a mixture of fury and something rarer, fear. "You will not turn this into a spectacle," she hissed under her breath. "Do you understand me? You will not use my daughter to elevate yourself." Daniel's calm stare didn't waver. "I didn't do it for elevation. I did it because she couldn't breathe." Elaine flinched at the simplicity of his words. Around them, the silence thickened. More employees had drawn closer, their ears tuned. She realized too late that her whisper hadn't stayed private enough. Daniel lifted Sophie into his arms, her small frame nestling against him. His voice carried just enough for those watching. "No parent wants to watch their child struggle for air. Not you. Not me. That's all this was." The room shifted. Elaine's power thrived on control, but Daniel had just reframed the narrative in a way no spin could erase. In one sentence, he'd placed them on equal ground. Two parents stripped of titles. Elaine's cheeks flushed. She opened her mouth to retort, but words failed. Instead, she spun on her heel and stalked toward the elevator, snapping at security to clear the lobby. Yet the damage was already done. The image of her leaving while Daniel stood surrounded by quiet respect was the one people carried with them back to their desks. Later that evening, as Daniel walked Sophie home, she rested her head against his shoulder. "Daddy," she whispered, "do people finally see who you are now?" He hesitated before answering. "Some of them do. Some of them never will. But that doesn't matter. What matters is, you always know." Her small arms wrapped around his neck. "I always knew." Back in their apartment, Daniel moved through the motions of dinner and bedtime, though his mind replayed the day. He thought of Elaine's fury, of the board's unsettled glances, of whispers traveling like wildfire through the building. He hadn't sought any of it, but it had found him anyway. And now the balance of power wasn't just tipping, it was sliding. Across town, Elaine sat alone in her penthouse, the drawing still tucked inside her folder. She hadn't thrown it away. She couldn't. The crayon colors stared back at her, mocking the steel fortress she'd built around her heart. For the first time in years, doubt gnawed at her. Victory strategy progress was undeniable now. Twice, Elaine's authority had failed where Daniel's expertise had prevailed. Twice, her empire of glass and marble had leaned on the man she called a clown. And though she would fight it with every weapon she had, PR, money, status, nothing could erase what every witness had seen with their own eyes. The story was no longer hers to control. Morning light spilled across the lobby's glass walls, but the usual hum of confidence was muted. Conversations dropped to whispers when Daniel pushed his cart inside, Sophie skipping lightly beside him before school. The janitor who had saved Elaine Whitmore's daughter was no longer invisible, and everyone knew it. Eyes followed him down the polished corridor, not with ridicule, but with something closer to awe. Daniel felt it but didn't slow. His focus stayed on Sophie, making sure her backpack sat right on her small shoulders, her inhaler tucked safely inside. For all the whispers, his priorities remained unchanged. Her health, her safety, her future. He wasn't here to bask in attention, he was here to endure. Still, the shift in the air was undeniable. Assistant smiled at him now, hesitant but sincere. A security guard nodded in respect, a gesture that would have been unthinkable a week ago. The very people who once ignored him were recognizing a truth Elaine had fought to bury. The janitor carried strength money couldn't buy. The elevator dinged. Elaine stepped out, flanked by 2 board members. Her white suit was immaculate, her posture perfect, but her eyes betrayed sleeplessness. Dark circles shadowed her face. She paused when she saw Daniel in the lobby, Sophie tugging gently at his sleeve. Conversations died instantly. The entire room seemed to freeze. It wasn't just another morning. It was a confrontation no one could avoid. Elaine straightened, trying to summon the authority that usually silenced rooms. "Mr. Hayes," she said crisply, "you've made yourself quite the spectacle." Daniel's gaze didn't falter. "I didn't make anything, Ms. Whitmore. Circumstances did. I just acted when no one else could." A murmur swept through the staff. The words hit harder than any speech. He wasn't boasting. He wasn't angry. He was simply stating truth, and truth carried more power than her polished veneer. Elaine's jaw tightened. "You're not paid to act. You're paid to clean." Before Daniel could respond, Sophie's voice broke in. Small, but piercing. "My dad saved Lila." The child's innocence cut through the tension like glass shattering. All heads turned toward her. The statement impossible to dismiss. Elaine's composure cracked. Her lips parted, but no words came. Cameras from the previous showcase had already spread across news outlets. Every assistant, every guard, every intern had seen the footage replayed. And now, here in the lobby, her daughter's friend had spoken aloud what no amount of corporate spin could erase. Daniel lifted Sophie gently into his arms. "Come on, Bug. Time for school." His tone was steady, unshaken. He turned toward the revolving doors, but the atmosphere behind him was electric. Elaine's authority had been challenged, not with defiance, but with innocence and fact. Once outside, Sophie clung to him as they walked toward the bus. "Daddy, did I say something wrong?" He kissed the top of her head. "No, Bug. You said the only thing that mattered." Back inside, the board members exchanged uneasy glances. One leaned toward Elaine. "He's right, you know. Optics like this, you can't fight them. He's already rewritten the story." Elaine said nothing. She simply adjusted her folder and swept toward the conference rooms. But her silence spoke volumes. For the first time, her power looked brittle. That evening, Daniel returned home to find a letter slipped under his door. No sender, no company seal, just plain paper. Inside, a single line. "Not everyone in that building agrees with her. Keep standing." He sat heavily in his chair, staring at the words. Whoever had written it understood the shift already underway. Elaine's empire wasn't unified. Cracks were spreading, loyalty fraying. The more she tried to crush him, the more people noticed how steady he remained. As Sophie hummed softly while coloring nearby, Daniel folded the note and slipped it into his wallet beside her picture. It wasn't about him. It had never been about him. It was about protecting her future, even if it meant standing against an empire. Victory strategy progress was undeniable now. Elaine's wealth and authority had failed twice in crisis, and her public dismissal had backfired under her own daughter's witness. Respect for Daniel was spreading beyond whispers. It was becoming part of the building's culture. Each moment chipped away at her control, and Daniel knew the final reckoning wasn't far. The next morning, the lobby was no longer just a workplace thoroughfare. It was a stage. Employees gathered in clusters, pretending to check their phones, their eyes darting toward the glass doors as if waiting for something inevitable. Word of the showcase incident had spilled beyond the company's walls. Even local media had replayed the footage of Daniel saving Lila. Now staff arrived not only for work, but for the drama unfolding between their CEO and the janitor she had humiliated. Daniel stepped through the revolving doors, cart rattling softly at his side, Sophie skipping just behind him with her backpack. The moment they entered, heads turned. Conversations paused. It wasn't applause, but it was recognition. The kind that carried weight. He kept his pace steady, eyes forward, refusing to bask in attention. His job was the same as it had always been. Clean the floors. Keep Sophie safe. Endure. Then Elaine appeared. She swept out of the elevators in a tailored black suit, her heels striking the marble like gunfire. At her side trailed 2 board members and a PR manager, all visibly tense. Elaine's eyes locked on Daniel instantly. This time she didn't avoid the confrontation. She walked straight for him, the lobby parting like water around her. "Mr. Hayes," she announced, her voice sharpened for the audience now gathering, "you've disrupted this company for the last time." The crowd stilled. Phones tilted upward, recording. The public confrontation had arrived. Daniel set his mop against the cart, turning calmly to face her. Sophie clung to his hand, sensing the weight of the moment. "I've disrupted nothing," he said evenly. "I've only done my job, first as a janitor, and when circumstances demanded, as something more." A murmur rippled through the staff. Elaine's jaw tightened, her composure cracking under the pressure of witnesses. "You've manipulated perception with these heroics. Don't think saving my daughter changes your place here. You are an employee, nothing more." The cruelty of the words landed heavily, but Daniel didn't flinch. He shifted Sophie slightly behind him, his eyes never leaving Elaine's. When your daughter couldn't breathe, titles didn't matter. Uniforms didn't matter. All that mattered was whether someone knew what to do. His tone was calm but carried across the marble lobby, drawing nods and widened eyes from the onlookers. Elaine faltered. She hadn't expected him to speak so plainly, to use the very crisis she wanted buried as the foundation of his defense. The PR manager tugged at her sleeve, whispering urgently, but Elaine shrugged him off. "You think this crowd proves something?" she demanded. "You think respect from assistants and guards makes you my equal?" Daniel's answer came like stone. "I don't need to be your equal. I need to be Sophie's father, and that means holding on to the work that keeps her medicine on the table, no matter how many times you try to strip it away." Gasps broke from the crowd. For the first time, Elaine's cruelty had collided with his humanity in full public view. She was no longer the untouchable CEO. She was a mother trying to silence another parent's fight for his child. One of the board members stepped forward, voice low but carrying. "Elaine, enough. Everyone saw what he did. Pretending it doesn't matter makes us all look blind." Elaine's face flushed crimson. For years, she had commanded with absolute authority. Now, in front of her own staff, her grip was slipping. The very control she valued was unraveling in the face of one man's unshakable composure. Sophie tugged at Daniel's sleeve, whispering, "Daddy, can we go?" He bent slightly, his hand brushing her hair. "Soon, bug," he murmured. Then, lifting his gaze back to Elaine, he added quietly but firmly, "You wanted to make an example of me. You did. Everyone here has seen exactly who I am and who you are." The silence that followed was devastating. Not a single voice rose in Elaine's defense. Employees lowered their eyes, unwilling to side with her, while others met Daniel's gaze with open respect. Elaine turned sharply, heels striking the floor like thunder as she retreated toward the elevators. But the damage was irreparable. Every phone, every whisper, every memory of this confrontation would echo long after the doors closed behind her. Daniel exhaled slowly, lifting Sophie into his arms. He didn't smile, didn't celebrate. Dignity wasn't about victory laps. It was about holding steady in storms until the truth spoke for itself. And in that lobby, surrounded by witnesses, the truth had spoken louder than anything Elaine could command. Victory strategy progress reached its peak. Her wealth and power had failed publicly, while Daniel's calm, proven expertise, revealed in crisis, had restored his dignity in front of everyone. Daniel carried Sophie through the lobby, the crowd parting silently as they passed. No one laughed at the sight of the janitor now. No one smirked, no one dismissed. They simply watched, their faces marked with something new: respect. The confrontation had been final. Elaine's retreat had told the entire company what no memo ever could. Her power was not absolute. Outside, the air felt lighter. Daniel set Sophie down gently, her small hand slipping back into his. She looked up at him, eyes wide with a mix of relief and pride. "Daddy, everyone knows now," she whispered. He smiled faintly. "They know enough, Bug, and that's all we needed." The bus ride home was quiet, Sophie leaning against him, half asleep. Daniel's mind turned over the past week. Humiliation, dismissal, ridicule, all of it flipped on its head by the simplest truth: wealth couldn't solve everything. Titles couldn't buy calm in crisis, and arrogance collapsed fast when confronted by a steady hand. Back at the apartment, he tucked Sophie into bed, watching her breathing steady, her chest rising and falling with the help of the small inhaler at her side. This was why he fought. Not for recognition, not for pride, but for her. Every moment of dignity he salvaged, every storm he endured, was to make sure she never carried the weight he bore. Meanwhile, inside her penthouse, Elaine sat in silence. The crayon drawing lay unfolded on her desk, its bright colors stark against glass and chrome. She stared at the smiling figures, Sophie and Lila, side by side, and for the first time in years, her reflection in the window didn't look untouchable. It looked small. The following morning, Daniel returned to the building as always. He didn't expect applause, and none came. But what did greet him were quiet nods from security, respectful murmurs from assistants, and the unspoken acknowledgement that something had changed. He wasn't invisible anymore. He was proof that strength came in unexpected uniforms. Elaine passed through the lobby with her entourage, eyes fixed ahead, no words exchanged. Yet the hush that followed her was different now. Not reverence, but recognition of her defeat in front of her own people. She had tried to bury him, and instead, her daughter's survival had elevated him beyond her reach. Daniel returned to his cart, mop in hand. He worked the floors as he always had, every stroke measured, steady. To him, dignity was never about the crowd. It was about showing up, about enduring with quiet strength. That was the lesson Sophie would remember, the one legacy he could leave her. that even when the world dismissed you, your worth wasn't theirs to decide. By the end of the week, the company had adjusted. Rumors no longer buzzed as whispers. They had settled into truths. Everyone knew the story now. The janitor who saved the CEO's daughter, the man she had tried to erase, the father who refused to bow. And in the balance of power, respect for Daniel Hayes had outlasted arrogance. The victory strategy was complete. Elaine's empire had bent beneath the weight of reality, and Daniel's calm expertise had risen in its place. He hadn't needed revenge. He hadn't needed recognition. The truth had revealed itself in front of witnesses, restoring his dignity and ensuring Sophie's future. Because in the end, that was all that mattered. If you've been with Daniel's journey, from humiliation to vindication, then you know the power of quiet strength. But this isn't the last story. The world is full of people dismissed too soon, underestimated too often, who carry more than anyone realizes until the moment of truth arrives. So tell me, what should our next story be? Give me the title, and I'll bring it to life. Subscribe and don't miss our next story. Title? Trust me, you'll feel it. And tell me in the comments, what injustice should we tackle next?